We're going to jump right into the New Testament text. So if you have your bulletin, you see Old Testament, then New Testament. But we're going to be in Hebrews. We're going to be speaking about a section in the letter to the Hebrews, and specifically chapter 10, verses 22 through 25. And as we step into this book, it's good to know that we don't know who the author is. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. Most scholars have not found the answer to that question, but here's something we do know about the author. He loves these people, and he sees these people waning in their faith. He sees that they are losing their hope. And so he is encouraging and exhorting them to have active faith, to remember the things that are important, to keep their faith active and strong. So this is the reading from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 22 to 25. Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. It's the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God for it. This past week, I went to a high school retreat, and that drummed up some memories for myself in high school and when I was a teenager, but really want to highlight that the speakers, when they would come up and share a message, each one of them would give a little bit of a testimony about their life, and lo and behold, each of them would say in the beginning of their testimony, I grew up in church, and then they would go into how, in a sense, their experience in church was not officially and fully what drew them into their relationship with God. It wasn't the constant Sunday morning coming and listening that changed their life. You see, that connects with me because I grew up in the church, but I didn't have an active faith. In fact, I would confess that my faith was stale and sterile. No one noticed my relationship with God. I hardly noticed my relationship with God on Sunday mornings. I wasn't stirred up to live for God. I was a spectator, but certainly not an active and faithful Christian. Do you know there is something that can stir up our faith? You see, I believed the things about God, but my faith seemed unexciting and just inactive. I'd have moments, there'd be high points. I remember going to Carowinds to a Christian concert, and the song was so beautiful. I remember crying and thinking, I'm going to follow God wholeheartedly, until the next week came along and other things took its place. My high moment was followed by forgetfulness. That was my journey with the Lord. I'd been interested one moment, then lost in the day-to-day the next. I was looking for something to stir my faith. Sometimes even now I can feel stuck in my head. I'm in seminary studying, and I read a lot of books about God. But knowing about God and living out my faith with the Lord are two very different things. So what is it? What can really stir up our faith? There is something in this text today that tells us we can have our faith stirred. I evaluate my life sometimes, my language, my prayers. You know what they reveal? If I'm honest, they can reveal sometimes when I'm evaluating this self-preoccupation that says stay comfortable. That's how I get convicted when I'm evaluating my life from time to time. But you know something else? I've read the Bible through a few times, and I have noticed there's not one Bible verse that says your top priority ought to be to stay comfortable. Not one. But yet, my draw and my faith journey is always at a fight with that. So here's the question for you. How's your faith journey? Does it feel active or sterile and stale, uninspiring? Are you bored most of the time or just plain forgetful of your faith throughout your week? Is your faith inactive? Do you have bright moments and then life smooths out into a grand gray landscape of scheduled appointments, meetings, and soccer practices? Like a teenager without vision for school, or those of us show up to church, get some knowledge, see some friends, and then only to wonder, what am I really using this faith stuff for? What if I told you there's something that can stir up your faith? I want to give a real quiz here. You don't have to have a pen and paper, but you got the sermon notes section, so feel free to write your answers. I'm going to go through them. There's 7 questions, but do it in your head if not on pen and paper, because I'm going to ask for the results without you having to raise your hand. You'll just think about it. Number 1, first question, other than a dinner prayer, do you pray with other Christians throughout the week? Yes or no? Number 2, do you talk about Jesus to other Christians outside of church or these church walls? That's number 2. Number 3, other than on Sunday mornings, do you have any other time in your schedule dedicated to growing in your faith in Jesus Christ? Number 4, do you share what you read in the Bible with another Christian throughout the week? Number 5, do you have an active faith? Like a soccer player has to actively kick a ball and not just know how, so you have to put your faith into practice throughout the week. On a scale of 1 to 10, do you have inactive faith? Number 6, again, there's 7 questions. Are you bored with your faith? Do you believe that your faith is stale? Number 7, where do you think you can have active faith stirred up? So how did you do? What I normally notice with questions like this are people who are hungry for the Lord, they don't tend to give themselves very good results. Because they're hungry, they know there's room between where they want to be and where they are. Hungry Christians are typically ones who say, man, there's room to grow. And I also notice, though, sometimes comfortable and stagnant Christians can give themselves an A on questions. They can feel like things are going just fine. Do you want your faith stirred? Or are you satisfied? Do you want to grow in your relationship with God? I know I've got lots of room to grow myself, so I need a consistent stirring of my faith. And we had some people that just went on mission trips, and I know that cement was a part of the journey. So like cement, we have to continue to stir up our faith, or else it's going to harden. But it takes time and energy to stir up that cement, just like it takes time and energy to stir up our faith. Pouring in encouragement from others, pouring in accountability from others. Then we can be poured out for others in service. Oh, let us not harden, but be poured out for others to build their faith upon our faith. Does God believe? What does God say? If we were to look in the Scriptures, which we're going to, what would God say about our faith? Does it need to be stirred up constantly? Of course. There's certainly no secret in the first step of active faith being stirred up, and that's to look back on your salvation. Active faith begins with remembering our first step of faith. Like Revelation 2:14 says, remember your first love. So a couple things to help us look into this. The first part of verse 22, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance in faith. When did you first draw near to Him? When did you hear the gospel and it went deeper than your intellect and into your very heart? When did you realize that you're not good enough to be in God's presence, yet God drew near to you through Christ and through His sacrifice, and now you're made right with God? When did you see that Jesus Christ is what you've been looking for, even though you had heard of Him before? When did that day, that moment happen? You must first have faith in Him before you can grow in your faith. That's common logic. Once you see Christ as King, then we're to hold on to promises with all our heart. That's the next verse. If you look at verse 23, it says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For He who promised is faithful. Isn't that a theme of the Scriptures? That God is a promise keeper. If we don't know the Scriptures, we don't know the promises He's promising to keep. But if we know what God promises, we can bank on it with our very lives. He is a promise keeper. So here's the question. According to this verse, do you have hope? Do you have hope in the one who keeps promises? Again, you can't have faith stirred up if you don't have faith at all. How do you know if you have faith in Jesus Christ? Because He is your hope when all else fails. That's your test. How do you know if you have a true relationship with Jesus Christ when all else is gone? Do you look to Him? When you're feeling like life is being sucked out of you, do you have hope of the one who says, I'll give you a hope and a future? When you are working at a job that you might not be satisfied, do you have hope in the one who gives you a greater mission than just what you do? When your marriage is struggling, do you have hope that God has a plan? Do you cling to Him? Do you pray to Him? Do you hope in Him? Do you have hope? Come to the one who gives us a greater hope than circumstances can give us. You know, Satan uses circumstances to frustrate us. He gets us looking away from God and at our circumstances, but what God does is He keeps His promises through any circumstance. It is ultimately for our good, and He calls us to trust Him in circumstances. In that, we can have ultimate hope. Okay, to have active faith, that's what we're talking about today. Active faith. You must first have the foundation in Jesus Christ. Then we need to stir up that faith. We need to keep that faith going, but how do we do that? How do we keep from being bored? How do we keep from losing things and forgetting about who and how great He is? How does that happen? Active faith is found in Christ, but He has chosen to stir up our faith by using other believers. That's what the rest of this sermon is going to be about. Christ has called us to stir up one another, and our church believes community groups is one of the best places for that to happen. That's why we've been encouraging community groups in the last 3 sermons. Community groups are a definite way to stir up active faith, and our fall session is beginning soon. I want to reread verses 24 and 25 of Hebrews 10, but I want to highlight something first. The author of Hebrews, when he wrote this letter, almost certainly was talking to a small group of believers. One commentator named William Lane says this: the early Christians met in ordinary rooms in private houses. Sounds a lot like a community group. They are undoubtedly, he continues, they are undoubtedly a small group consisting of members of a household and some of their associates and close friends. Their number, perhaps no more than 15 or 20 persons. That's like the first 3 rows over here. You guys would be the church they're talking about. This section says not to neglect to meet together. The author believes that they need to encourage each other often. In fact, he says earlier in the letter, in Hebrews 3, verse 13, to exhort one another daily. There's this daily exhortation. There's this daily connection that he is encouraging. This would surely happen in these house settings of 15 to 20 people. You can't exhort one another daily simply by attending church or even Sunday school. You must do life together. Let's listen to the Bible speak to this small group in the Christian community about how their faith could be stirred up. Verse 24, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. We're to consider each other and think about how to stir up one another. You're stirred up when you help stir up others. Did you catch that in the text? It's a relational process. It's back and forth, stirring one another up. It's a relational process. It's not just listening. You want to have an active faith? Well, the inward response to Christ should have an outward focus of serving Christ through serving one another, stirring each other up. Not just by an example. Being a godly example is not enough. You need to get in relationships and back and forth relationally relationally, stir one another up. This phrase, stir one another up, or stir up one another, is packed. It's a strong phrase in this text. If you want your faith to be more than a Sunday commitment, we got to look here. This phrase, to stir up, is more than just encourage each other. The verb here in the Greek translation is only found in one other place in the New Testament. It's where the Apostle Paul and Barnabas are arguing and exhorting one another and challenging one another about taking Mark on the next journey. It has a lot of intensity to this verb. Stirring one another up is more than just a light hello and how you doing. It means to challenge and hold each other accountable, to influence one another, to plead with one another. This each other language is not the pastor only. It doesn't say, let the church staff stir up your faith. It does say that all Christians in our community are called to do it for one another, to stir one another up. Your faith can be stirred up in community groups. What are we holding each other accountable for? Well, according to the text, it says we are challenging each other to loving others and good works. That's what it says we do. Being active with our faith. You may be thinking this is too much to ask of believers or to call each other to more active faith, to get people in your lives like this. That's too much. Well, so it was for some in the body of believers. The habit of some said, no thanks. This encouraging one another, this kind of engaging one another, this stirring one another up, no thanks. According to the context, those in the habit of not meeting together were deciding not to meet because they were tied up by regular things. It wasn't being scared of persecution, it was regular things, according to the whole context of this letter. Business affairs and schedule. Those were the reasons they weren't meeting together. And I wonder if that applies to our reasons for not meeting together and encouraging one another on a more regular basis. It hits home as reasons for me. I can tell you, I'm tempted not to have my faith stirred up. I'm tempted not to get out of my comfort zone. I'm tempted to keep my friends that I trust close and those I don't trust over there. I am tempted to do that very thing. But then I'm convicted it does not sound like considering how to stir one another up to love and good works in the text. It doesn't look like I'm able to keep people at bay in the Christian family based on this text. Who receives the good works? If we're stirring one another up to love and good works, we're continuing to reach out and bless other people. The Christians are not about their comfort in this text. They're about others. Some make their habit, though, not to meet together. What does the author say about those who are not neglecting meeting? Okay, so maybe talking to the people, I go to church, check. I go to Sunday school, check. I go to a community group, Trent, check. I'm good. Well, no, the author challenges you too. He says, and all the more, do even more, all the more as you see the day drawing near. Do these things and do them all the more. Are you a hungry Christian? Am I a hungry Christian? Are we hungry to draw closer to God? The truth is, Christ could come back at any time. I don't know the time, but the Scriptures tell us to live in a manner of urgency in our faith. Why? Because every day counts. Every word counts. Every deed counts. We're told we will give an account for our time. This next passage, listen to this verse. I got chills when I read it the other day, and I'm going to read it now with reverence. This is Jesus' words. Okay, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, is speaking. It's one of them red letter passages. Here's what Jesus says to us about how we spend our time, what we do and what we say. Verses 35 through 37 of Matthew chapter 12. I'll read it for us. The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Careless words. Words we don't care as much about. I could ask, how's your vocabulary? And sure, we all think about maybe the broad and negative speech that's out there, but careless might even mean neutral speech. What if Christ came to us and said, hey, Trent, throughout your week, I'm not in your vocabulary. It doesn't seem like you care about having relationship and encouraging one another about who I am. How's your vocabulary? Could he actually bring that before us and say, where am I in your words and conversations? What on your feed and your social media, what do you say about me or not say about me? Where am I? Where's your active faith? Could he say that to us? If we want to be in a place where we can engage and enjoy him and each other on a more personal basis, I do suggest community groups. You can have active faith being stirred up particularly with community groups. Here's one example. I remember speaking with a young Christian one time. I don't know if you've ever met somebody who one day they're one way and then they have some kind of spiritual moment and they don't change. They kind of stay the same. They get excited about the Lord. They kind of keep going in their faith. And I saw this guy and I was watching him and he just did not change. He didn't have a moment that mattered. He changed. His life was changed. And I said, hey, what's up? What happened? This kid was a pastor's kid. He grew up in the church. But something had happened. It just caught him on fire. And I said, what's up? And he said, I never realized the impact it would have for me to just speak Jesus out to my other friends, to other believers. I never realized what it was like to hear them speak Jesus' name to me. I never realized the power of Jesus' name in conversation with other people and not just in church. I never realized that. He had gotten stirred up by having fellowship with one another. Again, this idea of I grew up in the church, but my faith was not stirred up. He had become active, and he was having Christian community and speaking about God throughout his week and engaging with others. I've never heard a testimony. If you've ever heard people share testimonies, you might have heard them say, I grew up in the church, but I've never heard someone say, my family went to church and we had a group of believers come over on a regular basis and they talked about their active faith, but it never really impacted me. I've just never heard that. Parents, do you want your kids to see active faith among believers? Well, then I suggest a community group. This young man was changed by speaking about Christ with others. Panthers are coming soon, like a crazed fan cheers for his or her team. They speak about their team with others. I bet it ain't only on Sunday that some of us who love the Panthers talk about the Panthers. So it is for those who truly revere Christ. We talk about Him. The more we speak of Him and encourage others to trust Him, believers and non-believers alike, our faith and love for Him grows. We must celebrate Him more than on Sundays. We must speak of Him with our family and community and other believers. Okay, so that's who might be interested in community groups. Who's community groups not for? Okay? Who would this maybe not be for? Well, I would argue that it's not for those comfortable in life. It's just not for them. And here's what I mean by that. Paul reminds us in Ephesians 6 that we're in a battle. We got to put on armor. There's this challenge of our sin that we're battling against. If you're pursuing holiness and you're putting the current against God is in your face, because getting to God in holiness is difficult, you know what it's like. You know you're in a fight. If you take Jesus' great commission seriously, that we are supposed to teach each other the ways of the Lord, and we go and we try to do that and we get beat down, we know we need rest. Jesus knows we need rest. We need to be able to get with other believers who are hungry for Him. We need to get with other believers who are fighting for holiness every day, and we need to know that we can keep up the good fight. If you're comfortable, you're not in a fight. Probably not for those who are comfortable. Or maybe you're like me and sometimes you realize you're comfortable and you want to change that. You want your faith stirred up. But if comfort is what we seek, we won't seek out that kind of life-changing community. Community group is also not for those with no time. But what do we have time for that is better? I struggle to believe that there's much that is more important than following the author of Hebrews here, promoting to meet together and encourage each other, and all the more as the day draws near. If we knew Jesus were coming back next year, would our schedules change? I know mine would. I'd be more about Him, more seeking to love others, more needing to be reminded that I have to hold fast because every moment counts, so that I can hold on to that confession. What things are more important? Community groups and relational time with believers is for those who want their faith stirred up by other believers. I got a picture here that you can't really see, and these guys, they're not terrible looking, but you might not want to see them up on a projector anyway. But this is 6 guys, one of them's me, and one of them I did not have a special relationship with, but the 5 here, I spent a decade with them, walking along with them, and them walking along with me. I would have struggles, and they'd be there with me. We met every week. Sometimes we'd meet in a home, sometimes we met in Panera. Here, we're meeting at Cracker Barrel, a great place to have community, but that's another sermon, okay? But these guys changed my life. They're not pastors. They're not youth pastors. They're not paid staffers to do ministry. They're just hungry Christians that want to walk with God and would come to me and say, Trent, don't give up hope. Hold fast to your confession. It changed my life. Being involved in a church and hearing the truth of God is essential. Hear me there. I'm not saying community groups replaces church. I'm trying to say church is where we get the truth, and community groups is where we speak the truth to one another. And we encourage each other to hold on to our faith together. That's what I'm saying. These guys, we all went to church together, and then we would talk about what we're learning, and it changed my life. That's why I'm going so passionately about this, that I think this is what stirs up our faith. If you want faith stirred up, a community group could do that for you. It doesn't happen overnight, but as life brings blessings and pains and you walk together, you'll stir one another up. You'll love one another. You'll seek to bless even others with good works as you grow together. So just the last question here, what would happen if we all committed to having our faith stirred up by a community of believers? Well, it's kind of like a stick that you put on fire. That is not going to last very long. But if you put a bunch of sticks together, the fire lasts longer. I believe if we were all committed to being in a community together, our fire would continue to grow and it would continue to be sustained in our desire for one another. And that's the irony of blessing. Many times in the Scriptures, we see the best blessings of life are not cheap and easy. Sure, one very free gift we got was Christ. We got salvation for free, but it's because Christ paid a heavy penalty for it. He took a very hard step for us. But after that, as we come to trust Him, we must take steps of faith and believe God's promises of blessings. The sermon title in your bulletin, which I would probably change to how is your faith stirred up? How do you have active faith? But it says trust is not the first step. What I mean is trusting others is not the first step in building community. It's trusting God and His promises. That's where the Old Testament passage comes in today. In Numbers chapter 6, verses 22 through 25. Okay? God has promised the people of God in this time. They are becoming the people of God. They're in the wilderness, and they're getting ready, and He's getting them ready for 2 things. One, He's saying, I promised this land for you, and it is about time for you to go and get it. This is where they're at in the journey. The second thing He says is in order to go get it, you're going to have to be able to overcome evil nations and trust me that I am the one who will fight for you. So they're about to go into a difficult position. They're about to go into a place where they have to trust God. And this is what God tells Aaron to tell them over and over again. See if you've heard this before. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, Thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You, Aaron, shall say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. This was not just a delightful message He was giving them. God wanted them to be reminded of this because He knew they were about to go into a fight. They needed to know who would bless them and who would keep them. They're reminded here that in the midst of the battle, He will be with them, and He will be gracious to them, and He will give them peace in the midst of the battle. They go, they spy out the land in this story, and they forget His promise. They forget that God will bless them, and keep them. And so what happens? They turn. How do they turn? If we look at the section, we know that they neglected these spies, get together, they conspired together, and they said, here's the report we're going to give. They met together, but not to stir one another up to love and good works. They wanted to stir one another up to protect their story. We can't beat them. And so they go back and they tell the people of God who God said, I'm giving you the land, and you got to trust me that you're going to have victory over these people. They come back and they say the exact opposite. They're a small group of naysayers who seem to have authority and were able to convince the whole of Israel, minus a few faithful, to cry out. And here's what they say in chapter 14, they say, oh, that we would have died in the wilderness. These people who don't trust God's promise of blessing if they get past the discomfort that they have. They say, no, we're not going into the promised land. We can't do it. Oh, that we would just die in the wilderness. They get what they want. They all die in the wilderness, and their children are the ones who inherit the promised land. They don't get the blessing because they weren't willing to push through and trust God. This may seem drastic, but I believe that the author of this letter called Hebrews is saying there's a blessing to be had in meeting together, in stirring one another up, and doing it all the more. I don't know where I saw this before, but there's this idea of people in relationships where they're kind of like this. Okay? It's kind of like you stay there, but really, I want relationship. But I got to protect myself. Some of you might be like punching and kicking, like, you better stay away. I'm going to protect myself. But most of us are right here. You know, some of us, someone, opened his arms and let messy people in and sacrificed everything that messy people could have a relationship with the Father. Oh, the cross and the example it shows us. But most of us are right here. We got to fight past the discomfort to get the blessing. The people in Numbers didn't do that. It's the idea of quiet desperation that we hear from Thoreau. The irony of those who seek to keep everyone at bay. Small groups, another reason might be you just don't trust people. The irony of keeping everyone at bay is those walls also keep out love. It keeps out, I love what Jason said, it keeps out not only love that you can receive, but love that you can give. It is actually blessed to give. In fact, it says more blessed to give than to receive. But you block all that out. If you have to trust people first, like Christ, trust the Lord, and then offer yourself. Christ shows us His openness to relationships with messy people. And so, in conclusion, we come back to Him. Because it's all for Him. Community groups are to get to know Him more through doing life together and loving one another with active faith. This worship service is for Him. In fact, we worship God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit because of their great example. Because of who they are. They surely don't love us because we're trustworthy. They sacrifice great comfort and perfect relationship with each other to get involved with us here on earth. They left clear, perfect harmony to share their blessings with us. God gave us life, and He gave us His Son. Jesus Christ gave His love and consideration for how to stir us out of our death stupor. And the Holy Spirit who lives inside each believer spurs us on to love God and love others. We end there, community groups end there, a greater worship of the one who has given us a chance at deeper relationship with the Father. If you want to check out community groups, we're starting a fall session that begins at the beginning of September and finishes in November. Would you consider joining a community to stir you up to active faith? I believe, with the right motives, it could change your life. I know it did mine. May the Holy Spirit stir our hearts to live a more active faith by stirring one another up to love and good works. Let's pray.